Hello everyone, and welcome back to Red Right Hand Forge. This is Marshall, and in today's video I'm going to be making a chef's knife for a friend of mine who lives up in Chicago. At least I hope that's what I do. We'll see how it goes. I'll be working with Nitro-V stainless steel, which is a steel that I've never used before. Generally when I'm working with stainless, I gravitate towards 440C. I've got a few personal blades that I've had over the years, and they've held up so nice, and that's just kind of what I started with when I started working in stainless, and I kind of stuck with it. But Nitro-V has gained a lot of popularity in the bladesmithing community, particularly when it comes to chef's knives, because they see a lot of work and a lot of variety of materials that they work through. Supposedly has very good edge retention and corrosion resistance, so I thought I'd finally give it a try. One challenge is that the steel that I have is only 1/16 of an inch thick, so that leaves us very little margin for error when it comes to laying in the bevels and finishing, and if I decide to put a distal taper on it. So it's just something I'll have to be cautious of as we progress through the process here. I'm thinking something with a 7 or 8 inch blade and something maybe in the European chef's knife profile, but I'm not sticking to any specific template. We'll just kind of see how it goes as I'm shaping it. If you have any questions, ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll definitely get back to you. And if you're feeling really generous, please like and subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to keep the content flowing, and if you want to see what comes next, that's the best way to go about it. All right, thanks for watching, and wish me luck.
We start this project by cutting out a piece of steel from this slab of Nitro-V. Once I get it chopped out with the angle grinder, I take it over to the 2x72 grinder and start working on my profile that I've sketched out there. Using the small wheel attachment helps me to get into these little crevices for the contours and the handle, and it's just a nice tool to have for those tighter spots. Just sanding down the edges so they don't splinter into me and make me bleed all over my shop more than I already have. And with stainless especially, or any really harder steel, you want to make sure you get these pinholes drilled out before you heat treat it, because otherwise it's going to be next to impossible. Or certainly a lot more trouble than it's worth. If you do find yourself in that situation, by the way, a good solid carbide bit is the way to go. It will go through hardened steel. You just got to take it slow and steady, and it's good to use a lubricant as you're going through it. You can see there, one of my drill bits just wasn't doing the trick, so I took it over to my drill master and sharpened it, and that thing works pretty great. I have a slightly larger hole for the center pin that's going to have a bigger pin in it, a decorative pin, a mosaic pin that I got from a company called Mosa US. I can't remember where I got that. It might have been Etsy, maybe even Amazon. I just don't remember, but it's MOSA if you're interested. It's just pre-made mosaic pins for those of you who don't want to go through the process of working with all that epoxy and doing your own mosaic pins. Before the heat treat, I just kind of scuffed it all up, and I cleaned it with acetone after I took some sandpaper to it, just to make sure there were no residues or residual scale on there from the steel supplier. Wrapping it in foil with a couple pieces of brown paper. That paper will ignite at roughly 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's designed that the idea is that it pulls all the excess oxygen out of the envelope, which reduces the amount of scale buildup on your blade as it heat treats. Now, whenever you're working with stainless steel, the heat treat process is always a little more complicated and a bit more precise than working with just high carbon steel. For Nitro-V, what I'm doing is I'm bringing this up to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to hold that for about 15 minutes to equalize, and then I'm going to ramp as quickly as possible to 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll hold that for about 7 or 8 minutes, and that's my austenizing cycle. Once that's done, I quickly pull it out, and we're air quenching here between some aluminum plates, and I'll use compressed air to speed up that process. And once that's done, I'm going to clamp it between some angle iron back there just to keep it straight while I put it into a cryo bath. And this is the first time I've actually done a cryo bath on one of my blades, and we don't really have to do it. You can still get a good heat treat and a good hard blade if you skip this process, but what this does is it converts a lot of the remaining austenite into martensite. And I'm not a metallurgist or anything, but and I'm just kind of passing on what I've read, but essentially that just makes for a little bit of a harder blade. And this is for a friend, and I want this knife to last a good long time, and I don't want to have to worry about sharpening it all the time, so I'm just kind of trying to go the extra mile here. I'm using a solution of dry ice and 92% isopropyl alcohol, and that should give me, in this styrofoam cooler environment, should give me a temperature of somewhere around -75 to -95 Fahrenheit, which is sufficient for our purposes here. And that effect that you're seeing is called sublimation, and that's just the physical process of dry ice converting into a gas very rapidly. I'll zoom in here a minute and you can see how it bubbles and roils around. It's pretty cool. Be careful when you're handling this stuff. If you're making a solution like this, it's extremely cold, and obviously you don't want to stick your hands in there. Wear gloves. Don't dump it all over yourselves. Yeah, just use common sense and you'll be all right. We're going to let that sit in there for a little over an hour. I've heard a lot of people say to leave it in overnight, but from what I understand, you really don't have to do that. Once the core of the steel reaches your desired temperature, the temperature of that environment, the process of that conversion of the remaining austenite, it's pretty much already run its course once it gets to that temp. At least that's what I've been led to believe. I will say that, and I know this just from getting into the hand sanding process and just working with this steel after this part of the process, this is the hardest blade I've ever worked with. There's a noticeable difference. I've gone through more sandpaper. I went through more sandpaper on this blade than I ever have, just trying to finish sand it and get my grind lines out and just go through the steps. This is an extremely hard blade, and I'm pretty happy with the result. I don't have a Rockwell hardness tester, but I'm just kind of going by file testing, and again, just kind of using my experience, and by comparison, I can tell this is a much harder steel now. The last step in the heat treating process is the tempering cycles, and with this blade I put it in the oven at 400 degrees and let it sit for 2 hours. Then I shut the oven off, open the door about halfway so that it cools down kind of quickly, but not as quickly as it would if I pulled it out in the open environment. And once it reaches ambient temperature, I put it back in and do the same thing again, 400 for 2 hours. And then I open the door again and let it cool back down to room temperature. And we've got a heat-treated blade here with no warps or anything. Looks really good. And we start the grueling process of laying in our bevels and then on into finish sanding. Now for the bevels, if you watch my last video, I actually made a secondary platen for this angle grinder, for this bench 2x72 grinder, and the idea was that I could lay flat bevels in with a little bit more surface area to support the blade as it passes over the belt. And I really like that upgrade, the mod I did, but I didn't want to use it for this blade because I really want a little bit of a convex edge on this chef's knife. And you can see I'm actually kind of avoiding bringing the belt, the grind lines up to the spine as it gets close to the handle. So I'm kind of attacking at a 45-degree angle as I get close to that handle area, and that's just to keep the strength at that narrow part where the bevels meet the handle material. Ultimately, I want to bring this edge, or just behind the edge, to about 0.45 millimeters, maybe a little less, which I think is pretty good for a chef's knife of this size. And I get pretty close to that before I start the hand sanding process. This was a grueling hand sanding process. I filled up that entire garbage can behind me with these little squares of sandpaper because this blade just really just ate through the sandpaper. It was a very hard steel, and that's good, but it was a lot of work. I attacked this at 45-degree angles, and then I switched to lengthwise sanding pattern. I started at 120 grit, I think, and then I worked my way up to 800. When I get to 400 grit is when I stop to put my benchmark on. And I use the Personalizer Plus system, which is electro etch on this one. I don't like to stamp in my benchmark on a thin chef's knife like this. It's too easy to bend it, and it kind of interferes with my heat treat process. So this is the way I go with chef's knives or anything really thin like this. I use my old school benchmark. This is not my current benchmark or my logo you see on my page there. And that's just because my friend that's getting this knife, he's a cat guy like me, and I just think he liked that old logo a little bit better. Now once I brought this all the way up to 800, you can see I've got a pretty good finish on there. I decided to do something I hadn't done before, and I'm using this surface conditioning belt to not really grind, but add 45-degree kind of texture lines along the length of the blade. And the idea is that I'm hoping that this will kind of reduce suction as it goes through vegetables that are really wet, or like tomatoes. Sometimes those kind of things can kind of grab onto the knife with suction, and I'm hoping that on a micro level, that little bit of texture will kind of create some air pockets or some separation as it goes through that kind of material. I've never done it before, but we'll see how it works out. Now I'm just getting into the process of getting my handle materials ready. This is paper micarta, which is pretty much indestructible. I like working with this stuff. It's kind of a monster to sand. It's really easy to it'll show all your mistakes, so you kind of have to take your time with it. Putting a little flare on there with the octopus mosaic pins. Again, I got those from a company called Mosa US, M-O-S-A, and I think it looks pretty cool. Well, I guess that pretty much wraps it up for this one. As you can see, I didn't have a tomato handy, but I had a banana, and that's a similar consistency. I don't know if those texture lines helped glide through the material or not. I won't really know for sure unless I make two knives side by side and they're identical. with that exception. Then I'll be able to compare the results. But it definitely didn't slow it down, and the knife feels excellent. It feels extremely fast. It's a real cutter. So I'm pretty pleased with the way it turned out. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the process, and if you have any comments or questions, just leave them down below and I'll definitely get back to you. And of course, please like and subscribe if you want to see more content as I make it available. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.